So the work for the structure for the workshop is is quite straightforward. First, I'll say just a few words about where we are at. You know, the state of affairs. Just it's been a busy year for nuclear disarmament, with once again key multilateral processes happening, a war in the background, some key treaties crumbling and trying to salvage them. So it's a very busy year for the nuclear disarmament file, and those of us who follow it, you know, have been quite busy, as Ray and others will be able to attest to. Then we're going to look at, in particular, at two key processes that happened this year, both quite recent. So first, the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So we're going to see some highlights, some future direction where this regime might go, and a couple of words about Canada's position. And of course, we welcome your input in that regard. And Ray will facilitate that part of the discussion. And Ray was there in Vienna in June during the meeting of states parties. And then we're going to talk about the slightly more recent review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 10th review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was supposed to happen, as I'll explain in a minute, which was supposed to happen actually 2 years ago, but because of the pandemic was delayed. And also a critical part of the nuclear disarmament sort of conversation this year. So I will also talk about some highlights, perhaps some speculation about the future direction of this regime, and a couple of words about Canada's position. Once again, we'll welcome your input, and then perhaps some attempts, some conclusions about where we're in the nuclear disarmament regime. So a few words very briefly about the context where we find ourselves, and in 2022. I think for the past decades, one could almost say and be right that it is a critical time for nuclear disarmament. That it's a critical time to make progress, to formulate policies that reflect the urgency of the matter, but and the gravity of the threat. But I think it's not an overstatement to say that this has been really a busy year, an intense year, lots of things happening, both in terms of multilateral processes, but also in terms of reality, observable reality, and things that have an impact on nuclear disarmament and the prospects therefore. So the first thing to say, and this relates a little bit to the picture that you see on the right, is there's a widespread awareness of heightened risks. The nuclear risks are heightened, and they are real, and they are I think in a way demonstrable. And this is not an alarmist thing to say. I think some of the most authoritative observers and analysts of nuclear disarmament would coincide that there is a real risk. It's not fear mongering to say that there could be a conflict involving nuclear weapons, and this is of course not a situation we want to find ourselves in. The doomsday clock that some of you may be familiar with, which is maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, US-based group, very authoritative, and it's board with Nobel Prize winners and very authoritative observers on nuclear disarmament, have placed this metaphorical doomsday clock, whereby midnight represents the doomsday, some civilization-altering event, including possibly from nuclear catastrophe, at 100 seconds to midnight. It has never been closer to midnight. So this is a cause for concern. But you add to that, and this relates to the second point, that this assessment, and we've never been closer to midnight, was made before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So one can only speculate how the invasion would have changed this assessment, and we'll see next year what the bulletin determines. But I do think it is telling that even pre-Ukraine, which has exacerbated nuclear risks and nuclear fears, it was already at 100 seconds to midnight. So this is I think an untenable situation for the international community, and one that needs to be reversed. Otherwise, it's really getting closer and closer to this risk materializing. But you add to that, of course, Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine angle, which is a context that has permeated the two main events that we're going to discuss today with Ray, permeated the TPNW conference and permeated the NPT review conference, and it still remains unresolved. Most people will know that President Vladimir Putin specifically invoked nuclear weapons and spoke about placing Russian nuclear weapons on high alert status, which troubled most observers and received, I think, widespread rejection from the world. But let us not forget that there are other nuclear weapons as well on the other side, and the risk of escalation is there, and it's real, and therefore it's something to pay attention to. And there were a few conferences, the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons Conference, a one-day conference that preceded the TPNW conference. I'll let Ray comment on that briefly. The TPNW meeting of states parties itself in Vienna. Then we had the NATO Madrid summit. So this is the key Madrid summit, from which a new strategic concept for the alliance emerged, and this still contained this formulation of nuclear weapons as being considered the supreme security guarantee for the alliance. So that's also very relevant in the context of things happening this year. And of course, the NPT review conference during the whole month of August at UN headquarters in New York. So that's the general context. We will comment a bit further on some of the issues that I mentioned, but without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ray to talk to us a little bit about June in Vienna and what was happening there, and some of the significance of those developments. So Ray, please.
Thanks a lot, and thank you to Project Ploughshares for inviting me to participate in this event. And it's really nice to see all of your names, if not your faces, on Zoom today. So I'm going to talk mostly about the meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this was the 21st to the 23rd of June in Vienna. And like Cesar said, it was preceded by a one-day conference on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, which is the fourth conference on that topic that's been held in recent years. So in both of these meetings, there was really high-level active participation by TPNW states parties and signatories, and really, really strong moving statements from countries that have been affected by nuclear weapon testing in particular, and from across the global south. And I think this was something that I really wanted to emphasize in terms of not just the outcomes, but also the process of this meeting that has made it quite unique in nuclear disarmament, is that there was an emphasis on participation, a more diverse participation. And so the meeting was held in the global north, so that obviously has some limitations then on participation. So there was visa restrictions and travel difficulties. It took some folks from affected regions more than 24 hours to travel to Vienna. So that was a complicating factor. And as usual in nuclear disarmament gatherings, many of the activists and academics that were in attendance were still overwhelmingly from the global north. But there was more of an effort, I would say, that I've ever seen to have survivors, affected communities, civil society groups, and also government representatives from the global south at the meeting and participating more meaningfully than in any other nuclear treaty body meeting that I've ever seen. And also the decisions and actions that were adopted by 1MSP are really rooted in the lived experience of those who know firsthand the impacts of nuclear weapons. And so that was also something very unique to see. The Austrian government that presided over this meeting, they did consultations for more than a year online during the pandemic to prepare, and really made an effort to include affected communities and survivors in those discussions to build the outcome documents. In addition to this kind of diverse participation, we also had a few nuclear allied states or nuclear supportive states, whichever term you prefer to use, the ones who live under the so-called nuclear umbrella. So Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, they all participated. Switzerland also participated, and was probably the most conciliatory of all of the non-states parties, non-signatories, in terms of its approach to the treaty meeting and contributing constructively to the discussion, and also saying that it is going to review again its policy on the TPNW later this year. Germany was also surprisingly constructive, particularly when it came to looking at the victim assistance and environmental remediation provisions of the TPNW and expressing an interest in collaborating with TPNW states on those issues, though of course emphatically restating its commitment to NATO's nuclear deterrence policy, as the other countries did as well. So Sweden and Netherlands were more hostile in that regard, I would say. One challenging thing, of course, at this meeting, there was a lot of media in the room, and they paid significant attention, more attention to the Western states that have not joined the treaty than they did to states that were speaking very strongly in favor of the treaty and of their experiences with nuclear weapons. So we could see there a very Western media bias in the room, which is something to look out for in the future. So just quickly on the outputs from this conference, there was a declaration and an action plan both adopted. And like I said, there were discussions and decisions made in the room on the key topics, but a lot of the work was done in advance through virtual consultations and in-person consultations hosted by Austria for more than a year. Compared to many other UN outcome documents, particularly on nuclear weapons, the declaration is very, very clear in that it stands against nuclear weapons. It describes them as being used to coerce, intimidate, and heighten tensions. It talks about the fallacy of nuclear deterrence doctrines, and I'm quoting here, which are based and rely upon the threat of the actual use of nuclear weapons and the risk of the destruction of countless lives of societies, of nations, and inflicting global catastrophic consequences. So there's no punches pulled in the declaration. It is very, very strong. It also categorically condemns nuclear threats, which was really important given the situation that Cesar was describing with Russia's threats to use nuclear weapons recently. It expresses alarm and dismay by threats to use nuclear weapons and increasingly strident nuclear rhetoric. And the states parties condemned, and again, I'm quoting here, unequivocally any and all nuclear threats, whether they be explicit or implicit and irrespective of the circumstances. So this is also really important because while in this moment, Russia's behavior absolutely needs to be condemned, we also can't forget about previous threats and also nuclear deterrence doctrine as a whole that needs to be critiqued. So the states parties really, really went for all of it. And then the action plan provides a very clear path forward for collective action against nuclear weapons. It's a roadmap that consists of very practical steps to help implement the TPNW over the years to come. So some examples include starting work to establish a trust fund, which would support people and communities that have been harmed by the impact of nuclear explosions, so whether testing or use. It established a scientific advisory board for the treaty, which right now states are nominating scientific and technical and academic experts to serve on. The action plan also included several elements on gender and diversity of participation. And so states will appoint, the conference appointed a gender focal point to help countries operationalize these provisions of the treaty. States parties also agreed to a deadline for the destruction of nuclear weapons. So once the nuclear armed states join on, according to this treaty, they will have a 10-year deadline for the destruction of nuclear weapons with one possible extension. There's a plan also for universalization to get more countries to join the TPNW and many, many more. There are a few shortcomings. Of course, nothing's perfect and we're activists, so we need to always be critical of things. And so just a few points to think about moving forward. On the victim assistance and environmental remediation, This is really just focused, as it is on the treaty, on nuclear weapon use and testing, so on the detonation of weapons. But it doesn't really address the impacts of production of nuclear weapons, so uranium mining, fuel processing, tailings, waste storage. All of those aspects aren't really considered by the treaty. And I think a lot of folks working on these issues in Canada and in the US and in other places where uranium is mined or where we're dealing with waste storage and other aspects, these are things to keep in mind for the future. And I think also, you know, there's sort of, when it comes to diversity, it really does focus on a men-women binary. There's no conception of gender diversity or of intersectionality in terms of what are other aspects of diversity we want to pay attention to, including, you know, race, ethnicity, geography, class, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are also things that we can push on in the future. But a lot lies ahead for this treaty. We have a lot more countries that are already planning to come on board. During the meeting of states parties, 8 countries announced that they're working right now to ratify it, including Brazil, the DRC, Dominican Republic, Ghana, Indonesia, Mozambique, Nepal, and Niger. And we know that others also have internal processes underway. They just weren't in a position to announce it during the meeting. There's going to be a signing ceremony or a ratification ceremony for the TPNW during the UN General Assembly High-Level Week, which will take place on the 22nd of September, I think is the date that's been confirmed for that ceremony in New York. So we're hoping to have a few countries either sign the treaty or deposit their instrument of ratification on that date. And there will be more information coming from ICANN about that as we get closer. There's going to be the next meeting of states parties will be the 27th of November to the 1st of December in 2023. It's going to be presided by Mexico, but held at the UN in New York. And then Kazakhstan will preside over the 3rd MSP, but the dates for that and the location have not been decided yet. We also have, of course, First Committee coming up in New York in October. So we're going to have our annual TPNW resolution. And so we're going to try and get more countries to support that, even if they haven't already joined the treaty. That will be a key area of focus for advocacy this year. And so that's something important for action in Canada, which I can talk about next. And then as we speak, the Scientific Advisory Board is coming together. The focal points are being appointed. The working groups that were established by the action plan are starting to become operational. So we're going to see a lot more information come out over the next few months on this as we prepare for the next MSP next year. And then in terms of Canada's position, Canada did not attend the MSP. It did, however, attend the conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons the day before. So it was a bit of a silly situation where Canada did send a representative to Vienna. They just didn't stay for the MSP, despite other NATO states participating. So that was a disappointment. Canada has continued to reiterate in official statements that it supports NATO's nuclear deterrence policy and continues to say that the TPNW is not quote unquote effective because none of the nuclear armed states have joined, but it hasn't yet suggested any other path forward that actually has traction for nuclear disarmament. And so if Canada wanted to promote nuclear disarmament, not just in rhetoric, but in practice, it should not accept NATO's nuclear policy, should make it clear it doesn't believe in deterrence, which is the opposite of what it's doing now, should speak out against nuclear weapon modernization and nuclear sharing and the investments that we're seeing right now going into nuclear weapons. But since instead it actively and explicitly accepts all of this, including recently at the NPT, which I'm sure Cesar will talk about, it can't say that the TPNW isn't effective when it's one of the countries that is working to undermine the treaty. It's saying basically that law isn't effective because not everyone is following it, right? Which is a a ridiculous argument to make. So if that's Canada's position, they should make that clear. But Canada says it believes in international law. And that means encouraging others to join and abide by the law, not just saying the law is ineffective because the worst abusers are violating it. So I think that that's problematic for Canadian foreign policy in general. And of course, the treaty is effective, which would be another useful thing for the Canadian government to recognize. We have very active and successful nuclear weapon divestment efforts going on, including within NATO countries, including within the United States, where pension funds and financial institutions are divesting from nuclear weapons. There's been more debate and stigmatization of nuclear weapons within parliaments and at the city level. But we also need to really have Canada, I think, stand, if they want to promote nuclear disarmament but don't want to join the TPNW, there's still many things they can do. Of course, they have to join the TPNW as well. But I think also there's a role to be played in terms of renouncing deterrence policies within NATO, pushing back against NATO's nuclear policy, refuting nuclear modernization programs, and financing going to nuclear weapon producers. So there's a whole range of activities is what I'm saying for Canadians and to work on, but also for the Canadian government to change its policies on moving towards the signing and ratification of the TPNW and the complete renunciation of nuclear weapons. So I think I'll stop there for now. Happy to take questions. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ray. That was really a fabulous first-hand account of the proceedings in Vienna, some of the key highlights there, and I also very much welcome the words you said about the concrete ways in which the TPNW is already having an impact and being operationalized, and of course your analysis of where Canada stands and what Canada could do or could be doing. We do have some time for your questions or comments. We were happy to open the mic for whoever wants to take it. If you want to type them in the chat, that is another option. But you're definitely encouraged to ask questions, and we'll take it from there. So the floor is open, and Tamara has a question.
Yes, I was sorry,
Kelsey, please.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you so much for that, Ray, and thank you, Cesar. No, I was just going to restate Tamara's question. I think this came closer to the beginning of your presentation, Ray, but Tamara's asking what country was conciliatory. I didn't see the context for that question when it was asked, so I might throw that ball in your court if you can remember. And then, I mean, maybe one, if I could just butt the line after you address that one question, maybe to start us off. And you might have touched on this, but you know, some of us were surprised to see some NATO states actually go ahead and make the announcement that they were going to attend the TPNW as observer states. And if memory serves, Germany and Norway being some of them. So maybe speak to, if you could speak to that. I mean, I would like to think that it's only civil society that's pushing these states, and that's the reason why they've agreed to go as observer states. But I think some of us really look at the NATO bloc as monolithic, where, you know, there's kind of one hive mind. But the movement for Norway and Germany to attend the TPNW as observer states obviously undermines that theory. So maybe if you could speak to what are the driving forces behind some of the cracks in NATO all moving as one bloc. And of course, but beginning with Tamara's question. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem. So to Tamara's question, it was Switzerland that I mentioned. They are not a state party or a signatory. They did a review, I guess it was maybe last year or the year before, and decided they would not join the TPNW. But at the MSP, they said they're going to do another review, and it was going to be based on the outcome of the MSP as well as the NPT review conference. So if we take them at our word, I think they should be joining the TPNW soon. But we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, so Switzerland, I just meant by conciliatory, their statements were not aggressive or hostile towards the TPNW. They were picking up on points other countries were saying and being constructive in the dialogue. even as an observer state. So hopefully we can see a change of policy in Switzerland coming, and I know we have many Swiss activists hard at work on that. In terms of the NATO countries that came, what was interesting was most of the NATO countries that decided to come, they made that announcement before Russia launched its war in Ukraine. And so some people assumed that once that war began, NATO would go back to being a monolithic bloc and they would not come to the MSP, but that did not hold true. They still attended. And Sweden, as a new NATO member, was hostile to the treaty. The Netherlands was quite hostile, but Germany, as I said, was a little bit more engaging in certain aspects of the treaty, at least, although it and Norway both said, you know, we're still committed to NATO's nuclear deterrence policy. So they made that clear in their statement, and did not indicate that they would be joining the treaty anytime soon. But you know, for getting them there, it's been different in each of the countries. With Norway, it was the election of a new government, going back to some of the party leaders that had hosted the first conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons back in 2013. And so having those elements back in government in Norway, I think, has helped shift to a softer tone, shall we say, towards the TPNW. With the Netherlands, it was, again, the same way that got the Netherlands to participate in the negotiations of the TPNW was a vote in parliament. So the government did not wish to come, but had to come because of democratic politics in the Netherlands, basically forcing their hand to come. So that's interesting if that's something that works in different countries. So I think it's, you know, these cracks in NATO are very, very important for us to exploit. And we've seen different cracks at different times. We've seen Spain be softer towards the treaty in different moments. We know that the government of, or the previous government of Iceland was very sympathetic towards the treaty, but because of internal bloc politics, it wasn't able to join. We know, of course, that there's members of the Liberal Party in Canada that would like to see the government join, and many of the opposition parties as well. So these are things that we can work to keep opening those cracks and make it clear that NATO is not at all a monolith in this work, and help. Once we can crack that, of course, you know, there's a safety in numbers thing, but if we can get one or two to sign the treaty or to take up different activities in favor of the treaty, then that will become easier in other NATO countries as well.
Excellent, thank you, Ray. We have another question from Tamara, and I would say, once again, if anyone wants to take the floor, we have envisioned this event as not so much a webinar, but hopefully more of a conversational feel. So we are happy to pass the torch, of course. If you could just raise your hand and then unmute. Tamara brings up the point, the F-35 acquisition in Canada. Obviously, Canada is going through the process of procuring 88 new fighter jets. They're asking whether or not this was brought up. I believe it's to the angle that, yeah, potentially these aircraft could be nuclear armed. Were these airplanes brought up, or, you know, other conventional weapons kind of brought up in this context? Yeah.
No, they were not brought up at this meeting at all. And nor in the NPT, and Caesar's going to talk more about that. But it's interesting, though. This is an interesting point to raise, because often these specific programs aren't discussed at multilateral treaty meetings, but then one that really became a hot topic at the NPT was the new AUKUS arrangement and the sharing of nuclear powered submarines and the fissile materials necessary for that and the equipment and technology necessary for that. So it's interesting that became something that states were expressing specific concern over, but the F-35 and many of the other specific, say, nuclear modernization or acquisition of nuclear capable technology has not been raised at all in the NPT context. For it not being brought up during the MSP, that sort of makes sense because Canada is not a state party to that treaty, was not participating in that meeting, so discussing Canada's behavior wouldn't really make any sense in there, but it would have been a valid issue, I think, under the NPT. And I'm sure Cesar has more thoughts on that and insights.
So thank you for that, Ray. We do have a couple more minutes scheduled for Ray's module, but if people aren't feeling particularly chatty, then we can move on to Cesar's module, which will look at the NPT RevCon, which of course took place in August.
I see
Vicky.
someone with a hand up though. Yeah, Vicky.
Yeah, and Debbie.
Okay,
Good morning.
please.
Ray, you had mentioned pushing back eventually around the production of uranium and, reprocessing plutonium and all the things that go into making nuclear weapons. I'm in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on the Interchurch Uranium Board and Educational Co-op, and we're part of a national network trying to stop small nuclear reactors in Canada. Can you comment on, it's very hard to get this into a national movement right now or get any traction. Can you comment on this?
On the small modular reactor element,
Yeah.
you mean? Yeah, so I think that's super important. So thank you so much for your work to stop this. And I think, unfortunately, it's become part of the dialogue on climate change, right? Sort of the nuclear industry trying to capitalize on climate change as a moment to resell nuclear power as clean and cheap and blah, 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 all the lies that we already know. So I really think that connecting to the climate movement and doing education among climate activists who, unfortunately, I think just don't know what they're talking about when it comes to nuclear power sometimes, is really, really key. And so, yeah, and the whole fuel chain, if you will, absolutely needs to be addressed. But I think that the nuclear power element is something that, it's not dealt with within the treaty bodies that we're talking, or it is in the NPT, but not, and there was a lot of gross favorable language around nuclear power in the outcome that wasn't adopted from the NPT. But in the TPNW, it's not really, there's the same line about having access, but it's not to nuclear power, but it's not a treaty to facilitate that or to promote nuclear power, at least. So in that sense, it's been a bit cleaner on the TPNW side. But I don't know if Cesar is planning to talk about the main committee 3 nuclear power absurdity. But yeah, there was a lot of bad things there that happened this year. So
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Ray, and thank you so much, Vicky. Great to see you, by the way.
Yeah, see you.
Yes, of course. Debbie, I see that your hand's up. If you want to take the floor, yeah.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ray. That was really very helpful. Being given some context of what was happening at the meetings around the TPNW. So I'm part of a small group in Ottawa called Ban the Bomb Ottawa, and we managed to get our city council to unanimously endorse that and join. And so we're going to follow up with our local MP, because we had on August the 6th, we got people who came out to sign a sort of virtual or symbolic cover page of the TPNW. And so we're going to present it to our city council or our Liberal MP. So my question has to do with why Canada was what do we take from the fact that Canada was at the humanitarian impact meeting, and how can we use that for more leverage with the government?
Yeah, so Canada has attended all of the past conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. There was one in 2013 and 2 in 2014, and so this was the 4th one. And Canada's consistently shown up. It's usually gone along with the other NATO country line, which is basically, yes, we recognize that the effects of nuclear weapon detonation are catastrophic, and we don't want to see that happen, but we're not actually going to do anything to prevent it. And in fact, we're going to, facilitate nuclear deterrence theory and the perpetuation of nuclear weapons. Obviously, they don't say that, but that is the effect of their policy. But I think it's good to welcome that they participate in these meetings, that they're willing to talk about it, because the nuclear armed states, for the most part, refuse to even show up to these discussions. But I think then we need to pressure Canada to acknowledge that, if it accepts that the risks and the impacts are catastrophic, then it needs to actually have policies that move us away from nuclear weapons and towards nuclear disarmament, because this is a very grave inconsistency in its foreign policy. And I see in the chat that Tamara has another question about the FMCT, but I think I'll leave that to Cesar, because that'll probably come up more in the NPT conversation.
Yes, happy to address that in a couple of minutes.
So thank you, Debbie, for that question. Thanks, Ray. And thank you, Tamara, for the questions as well. Larry, I see your hand is up. So we can take this question. And then if there's any more, maybe one quick one. But if not, Larry, you'll close us off here. Go for it. Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a question. I'm sorry, I might have missed like the first few minutes of the meeting. Maybe it was discussed previously. Was there anything talked about in regards to smaller nuclear powers like India, Pakistan, and Israel? Curious what came up in conversation with that, if any of those governments had any representatives there when this was going on?
They did not send observers to one MSP, so they were not present in the room. I don't think any of them were at the Humanitarian Impact Conference. Do you know, Cesar? I don't believe that they were, though.
I don't believe any of them were.
No. Yeah, I think it was nuclear armed free in Vienna the whole time. So yeah, so they didn't come up at all. But of course they do come up in the context of the NPT and universality of that treaty, since they're the only ones that are not party to that treaty. And we've seen recently, of course, DPRK's new law on being a nuclear weapon state, and the continued modernization of nuclear weapons in each of these countries as well. India accidentally launching a nuclear weapon into Pakistan. Oops. So yeah, there's been a lot in the news about them recently, but not really being dealt with at these multilateral treaties where they're not party.
Thank you for that. We will close off quickly. Matt, I see you. Mr. Lingard, and then
thank you very much.
Of course, and thanks for coming. Great to see you, Matt. And then after this, we'll move on to Cesar's module.
I similarly need to apologize that I wasn't able to be here at the beginning, so I'll have to go back and watch it when it's uploaded. But I was wondering, Ray, I know you've done a lot of work on gender-based violence and disarmament, and I was wondering if that was raised in Vienna as well when you were there.
Yeah, the TPNW itself has in its preamble a recognition of the disproportionate impacts of ionizing radiation on women and girls. So this is the first time in a nuclear weapon related instrument that this has been recognized. And then the TPNW also calls on states to increase the participation of women in discussions. So as I noted earlier, it's sort of a binary approach to diversity, and it only looks at gender diversity, but is still a really important starting point for us, and gives us ground to work on that. So those are sort of the two issues that the TPNW directly talks about gender. But then of course, there's also other elements of gender consideration, including gender norms, and sort of the, the ways in which weapons are seen and talked about and considered, and how that affects our perceptions of security. That was not raised very much in Vienna. It did come up a little bit more in the NPT. I don't know if Cesar plans to talk about that, but actually Canada led a surprisingly good statement on gender diversity and inclusion. And it was sort of the most progressive statement we've ever had in either the NPT or the First Committee or any kind of nuclear related forum on these issues. It's still, didn't go far enough for us as the activists, as feminist activists, but it was a really big step in the right direction, and got, I think, 69 states or something like that on board, Cesar, or 67, something like that. So yeah, more to come on that.